months ago we talked about railroads. And originally when I did these presentations, I just did railroads, but I realized there's lots of other transportation we have in Suwannee County. And so I created this, I think, last year, and I've added to it since then, but other methods of travel. So we're gonna be talking about things like ferries and steamboats and airfields, airplanes, those kinds of things. So that's what we're going to look at for the next hour or so. Well, let's start with ferries. Ferries, for a long time, most of history here in Florida, were the major ways of crossing the river. You didn't have cars, you didn't have steamboats. You basically would either get in a canoe, if you're a Native American, or you would have a ferry crossing. Lots of ferry crossings, or the Suwannee River, the Santa Fe, the Lappahaw, lots of different places around here had those. They were pretty easy to build, you know, just build a flat bottom boat, if you will, and tie a chain from one side of the river to the other and cross it. So it's pretty easy to do. And so this picture here is one from the 1950s. I think it's in Fanning Springs. One of the last ferries on the Suwannee River. You can see the car there. But this would have been similar to what the ferries would have been 100 years before and more. Traditional ferry crossings. It's just kind of funny. This is post-World War II, and yet you see a car on a ferry. It's just not something you would see in Florida anyway very often. But that's basically what a ferry would have looked like in the 1800s, 1700s. They would go by various names. Usually it would be whoever was running it. So it could be Hooker's Ferry or Noble's Ferry or a lot of other folks that were running. Lots of different names over the years. For instance, the one I've got here is an example. Suwannee River State Park, which at one time was the community of Columbus and then Ellaville. In the early 1830s, it was McCormick's Ferry. In the late 1830s and 1840s, it was Platt's Ferry. And the 1870s and 1880s, it was Dean's Ferry, and then some others. So it would go, it's the same location, just bought out by different people over the years. So eventually it was replaced by a vehicle bridge. And that's what you see for a lot of these ferry crossings, is eventually where a bridge would be built, were originally ferries. So this is a map I've got that I've collected from various places over the years, various folks, but it shows there were at least ferries in these locations. There might have been some more I don't know about, but there were at least ferries in all these different locations. And generally speaking, they were about 5 miles from the next one over, at least 5 miles. Usually by state law, they had to be at least 5 miles removed. Didn't want to inundate. But some of these later became steamboat landings, and then later on bridges. So a lot of those today are bridges. And some of those roads leading to them still bear at least one of the ferry names, ferry owners' names, such as Noble's Ferry. Noble's Ferry Road that goes up, the one that's towards the top, that's Noble's Ferry Road. Named after Mr. Noble, who owned it at one point, the late 1800s, early 1900s. County Road 349, or 249 today. Lots of different roads would go to them because those are the major access points on the river. So this is one of the many ferries on the Suwannee River, late 1800s, very early 1900s. Again, very simple. Just flat bottom boat, cross from one side to the other. The first known ferries were the ones that were operated by the Spanish during the first Spanish period. They had ones at what's now Charles Springs, which was the mission side of San Juan de Lucara. And that was basically where the Camino Real would cross the Suwannee River, the old Spanish Royal Road. So it would cross at Charles Springs, so they had a ferry crossing there. Now the Spanish didn't actually usually operate them themselves. They kind of forced the Native Americans to do it, the ones that had been converted to Catholicism. According to the records, the old Spanish records, it was not a job that the Native Americans liked to do. And so there were frequent desertions because of the ferry crossing, because of other work the Spanish would have them do. But that is what happened. So the first known ferry, American ferry anyway, if you will, was approved on December 28th, 1824, which was the same day St. Augustine was incorporated as a U.S. city. And this ferry was approved for Reuben Charles. You can kind of read it at the top left and going down to the top, bottom right. Reuben Charles was granted a ferry at what is now called Charles Springs, and that's why it's called that, because of the name. Shows a couple different views of it. They're actually working on, I think, a new floating dock over at Charles Springs right now, but that's basically as it looked, I think, last year when I had the pictures downloaded. But that dock, or the ramp down, the boat ramp, is basically where the old ferry crossing was, more or less. And as I said, they were, generally speaking, over the next 20 years, a lot of other ones would pop up, those that I showed you on the map a minute ago. And generally speaking, 5 miles apart, because that's what the state mandated. Usually when they did that, they also authorized them for 10 years. So you would see somebody getting approval for 10 years, like this case here, Charles, a term of 10 years. As long as they put it into action and kept operating for that 10 years, they will be able to keep it. Let's see. Trying to go through my notes. Yeah, you could charge for people, you could charge for animals. Basically that's what the person did to make a living. They were the ferry owner and operator. So you charged everybody and everything that crossed from one side of the river to the other. And originally it was the territory, the state or the legislative territorial government that authorized these ferries, but later on, through the Civil War state constitution, after it became a state, it basically went to the hands of the counties. So the state the territory / state of Florida used to authorize, like this one here, but later on it was the counties. So in our case, Suwannee and Lafayette for this one will be the ones operating those kinds of things. So we've got a lot of records because of that at the courthouse. I've got a lot of these ferry crossings, and I'll show you a few of them as we go through this presentation. They're kind of interesting for a number of reasons. First off, it kind of shows a lot of the names of the people that operated them. So there's a lot of names in here that you may or may not recognize. Number two, it usually, not always, but it'll give you a description of where the ferry was located. Sometimes township, range, and section. That's real handy because that's a known location on a map. Sometimes they would say at the former location of so-and-so's ferry. Well, you don't know where so-and-so's ferry was, so it's kind of aggravating sometimes. Other times they show the variety of the people, the carriages, the animals that cross the ferry, and then how much it costs just to go across the river. And of course, Suwannee County being surrounded on 3 sides by rivers, if you wanted to get anywhere west or south pretty much, and north pretty much, you would have to cross by ferry, so you'd have to pay. And not everybody could afford to pay, so they just didn't leave Suwannee County, or they would go the Lake City route and go around. So this is a portion of one of the pages. This one actually is from J.A. Ivey and Brothers, which would include his brother Robert Ivey, the guy who established Branford. And it basically was from 1880, and where they were approved to operate at Rollins Bluff, which is now called Branford. And these prices are about 30 times less than what it is today. So whatever the number is you see here, multiply it by 30, and you've got an average of what it would cost today to do that. So let's see, a 6-horse wagon was $1 back then, which is 30 bucks today. A 4-horse wagon was 75 cents, so it'd be about what, $24, $26. 2-horse wagon was 50 cents. You've got a 1-horse wagon, a cart or buggy would be a quarter. A man and a horse was 10 cents. A man on foot, which it says there is 5 cents. Loose horse or cattle per head, 5 cents each. Sheep, goats, hogs were a penny each, so 30 cents each. So if you're taking over a whole flock or a whole herd, it might cost you several dollars, which would be hundreds of dollars today. But that's just typical of some of the ferries that we have in the courthouse, the documentation of several ferries. Kind of interesting to go through there.
Was the ferry at Hatch Bend in Lafayette County, or was it in the bottom end of Suwannee County?
I'd have to go back and look.
Just below Branford.
Right. I think that one was at one time operated by Lafayette, or it was listed as something else, one of ours. I'd have to go back and look. Good question there.
It was operating in 1963 when I went down to it. The editor of the Democrat and I went, and we were going down the river. We stopped for that, and the ferry operator let us winch it across. The,
Oh man, you paid him to work.
I know why he wanted to let us do it after we did it, but the car, someone would phone, and he would come down, meet them, and when the car, or this was a truck that we ferried across, came down, it rode onto the ferry, but the ferry was, both ends of it were chained to a big post, so when you drove off or started driving in with the vehicle, ferry didn't move out into the river. And then you got to the other side and you had to tie it up so he could drive off.
It's crazy.
I don't know what he charged, but I know that cable, you just winched it forward. Went up.
That's funny. I didn't know it was still operation that long.
It was
Wow.
in '63.
That's probably Lafayette County side. I don't remember records that far.
Well, it's 4 or 5 miles south of Branford.
Yeah, wow. Interesting, that's funny. We had lots of ferries that continue to operate in the post-Civil War post-Civil War era. You've got Woods Ferry run by Allen Woods, which was upriver from Suwannee Springs. It's now on property owned by Water Management. I've already said Nobles Ferry, which is between Suwannee Springs and Columbus. The one at Columbus Ellaville, which was run by Charles Dean, A.C. Stevens, and J.F. Sherwood in the 1870s. 1889 it went to W.R. Lee, and it's basically where the Suwannee River State Park is today. Horton's Ferry was run by John J. Horton in Dowling Park, established in 1880. Irvin's Ferry, which is the picture here, Irvin's Ferry by Washington L. Irvin, established in Louisville in the 1870s, early 1880s. Apparently, supposedly, this guy right there is Washington L. Irvin, who was the founder of Louisville and was operating this ferry. There's also Grant's Ferry run by William Grant, J.F. Sherwood, either J.L. White or J.T. Brannan, and that was at Convict Springs down over in Lafayette County in the 1870s and 1880s. You've got Roland's Bluff Ferry at Branford run by the Idings. So lots of various ferries operating at the same time all along the river. This is a portion of the petition from Mr. Grant for his ferry operating in 1873. He's writing at this point to the County Commission, who are now responsible for setting it up. And I'm guessing it depended on where the person lived, because sometimes it was Suwannee County that would approve it, sometimes Lafayette County. Like at Hatch Bend, did he live on the Lafayette County side? Probably. So Lafayette County was responsible, I think. But in this case, Mr. Grant lived on our side, so we were responsible for it. But gradually, as vehicles came into existence and bridges for vehicles started to be built, these ferry crossings started to go away the way of the dodo, replaced by boat ramps or bridges, or just abandoned. So you can still see some of them, things like that at the Suwannee River State Park. You can see the old ferry landing. It's basically a ditch going down to the river. You can walk over it as you go to the old railroad bridge, old vehicle bridge that was there. You can still see where some of them were. And if you look real closely, there are some folks that do a lot more of this kind of research than me, and a lot more kayaking down the river. But you can see different trees, and you can see where they were notched, where they were wrapped with the chains, those kind of things. So you can tell where the ferry crossings were from that sometimes, some of the old cable markings. So very interesting. But that is basically an era of our history that's gone here in Suwannee County. So moving on to steamboats. Steamboats. The first known steamboat that crossed into Suwannee County via the Suwannee River, obviously, was the steamboat Minerva during the Second Seminole War. She was operating on the lower reaches of the Suwannee by 1836. Now, according to some sources that I've read over the years, she might have even actually steamed upriver to Suwannee Springs, where there was a fortification, if you will, to help with the garrison there. And to get that high, it was because it was flood stage. Otherwise, you would not be able to steam up that far. But lots of steamboats on the river over the years. In 1839, the state, or the territory at that time, was looking at clearing obstructions at the mouth of the Suwannee River, basically to allow a channel 9 foot deep to allow steamboats to more easily sail up and down the Suwannee River. And it looks like they did that by 1845, because by then you've got the Orpheus, which is the first steamboat with a regular run on the Suwannee, and she was running between Cedar Key and Columbus, which was the Suwannee River State Park here in Suwannee County. So she was running up and down river. She actually was lost on the Suwannee River in 1847, and there was an auction held to dispose of her remains. Columbus was still a major point of steamboat operations up through the Civil War, even when the railroad bridge that you can see there in the background was completed. And that was the focus of the Union attack that was stopped at Olustee in 1864. A wooden covered railroad bridge. We talked about that in the past, one of the other presentations. But that's basically as far upriver as the steamboats would come, usually. Every now and then they can steam a little further up, but that was the normal head of the river for the steamboats. Pre-Civil War, you've got Captain James Tucker operating on the Suwannee River. Several years, he has a steamboat named the Madison. He actually has a couple steamboats over the years, but the one he's most closely associated with is the Madison, built in either 1854 or 1855 up in New Albany, Indiana. He named it for his hometown of Madison, Florida. Ship was 120 feet long, 22 feet wide, 4 feet deep, displaced about 100 tons. So not huge when you think about ships, ocean-going ships. But it's a pretty good size for the Suwannee River. I mean, 120 feet long up and down the river. Kind of interesting. She would be operating on the Suwannee River pretty much her entire life. He used her for twice a month mail service between Hernando County and then up to Columbus and those kinds of things. So she was up and down the river regularly. For many years, the state or the territory / state had declared the Suwannee River navigable only up to Columbus, like don't go further than that in a steamboat. Well, he thought it could go all the way to White Springs over in Hamilton County. So, despite the warnings of the people around him, he set sail, and fortunately for him, there's lots of rain, whatever, so the Suwannee River flooded its banks. And so he got all the way up to White Springs and then came back. Now then, because of the trees and stuff, he lost his funnels, he lost his pilot house, a lot of his upper works were done, but most of the boat made it all the way up and down. So the state declared the river navigable all the way up to White Springs, but that just was not the norm. Normally it was Columbus. When the Civil War started, he used the steamboat as kind of like a gunboat, put some men on it, and a gun on it, and it would kind of patrol the Suwannee River, especially the lower reaches, to protect it from Union forces. He actually, on July 4th, 1861, captured 3 schooners that had been captured by the Union forces. He recaptured, and they were full of railroad irons and things like that that the South couldn't easily produce. So she was used kind of as a protector for the Suwannee River to allow blockade runners to come up and down to drop stuff off. 1863, he is ordered up north with his men to join Robert E. Lee's army, and basically the Madison is scuttled at Troy Springs. The thought is that he wanted to come back after the war, refloat her and reuse her, but it just didn't work out that way. It did not work out because there were still 2 years left of the war, and people scavenged a lot of the upper works. If you're going to build a house or something, why would you go out and cut a tree down and fashion it in the right shape when you've got a perfectly good steamboat sitting there in a spring that's already got pre-cut wood and it's already made to build with? So let me just take that. And oh yeah, why should I go try to scavenge for boiling water when there's boilers and funnels that are made out of metal? I can just cut them in half and put water in it and boil it and get the salt out. So they basically scavenged the ship. And so after the war, really nothing was left above the water, pretty much just the hull. And so Captain Tucker never reclaimed his steamboat, and so she remains in Troy Springs today. Now there are some archaeologists that think this is not the Madison because of the length. The length is different. But if you look, the stern has washed away because of how it was sticking out to the river. So over the years, the stern has been washed away, so the length is going to be shorter, obviously, if you cut off the rear of it. But it's old. That's another picture from the early 1900s. I mean, that picture shows a little bit more. You see part of the hull. Not much left. And that's a picture I took back in '07 when I was there. You can still see the keel and some of the bottom planks. Basically, the river was low enough there, it was only about a foot of water over it. So I was like snorkeling and crawling along the ribs, just by, floating on the water, top of the water. It was so shallow then. So there weren't a lot of steamboats on the Suwannee River during the war. After the war, it takes a few years to come back, but eventually the Weywanock starts running in 1872, and she went between Cedar Key and New Troy, which at the time was the county seat of Lafayette County, and is traveling there. So she would transport materials and goods between New Orleans and Key West. Basically, she was the connector to that. And then in late summer of 1874, she went over to Pensacola, eventually to New Orleans, and she stayed there for a few more years. But she was replaced by this boat in better years, the David L. Yulee. It was about 90 tons, 82 feet long, 22 feet wide, 4 feet deep. So these boats are all shallow, so they can come to the Suwannee River easily. And pretty much the Yulee spent most, if not all of her life on the Suwannee River. That's just where she was, up and down, mainly carrying freight, occasionally passengers. But she only lasted a few years. She was condemned in 1885, and she sank close to the mouth of the Suwannee River. So this is a picture of her remains in the 1950s. I'm not sure if they're still there or not, but you can see the trees that have grown through the hull, even at that point in the 1950s. Another steamboat that plied the Suwannee River was the Erie, built in Jacksonville, 1876, only 34 tons, about a third of the size of the other ones that were before her. She was only 70 feet long. She had 2 decks. She had a crew of 3 officers and 12 men. She carried passengers sometimes, but normally she was hauling freight. And you'll see that with a lot of these steamboats. Mainly it was cargo, freight, sometimes passengers. She went over to Cedar Key in 1880 and then was sold to Manatee County merchants in 1883. This is not her, by the way. This is actually the Belle of Suwannee, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So, we've talked in the past about the 2 Henrys of Florida, Henry Flagler and Henry Plant. Henry Plant was more here. Henry Flagler is more on the coast. Henry Plant built a lot of the railroads that were in Suwannee County, some of the major ones like the ACL, or what will become the ACL. But he also had steamboats, so he brought in this steamboat, the Caterbell, which began operations in 1883. She was 125 feet long, 25 feet wide, 3.5 feet draft. She was a stern-wheeled 2-decker. She, like a lot of these steamboats, on the first deck would haul freight and cargo type stuff. Second deck, she would have passengers with the upper deck. There's advertisements stating that she connected with the newly built railroad down in Branford, which was built by Mr. Plant. So he was one of those that would use steamboats, railroads, things like that, even hotels to get folks in. She was not very successful on the Suwannee River, so he basically moved her to Columbus, Georgia, and didn't do too well. She was on the Apalachicola River and was abandoned by 1885.
Is that Cotton Bales?
Yes, that is. That is not, that's on the Apalachicola River. Yeah, definitely not Suwannee, a little too wide. Yeah. So by the time the Caterbell left service, there was another one called the Bertha Lee, and she was built in 1879, way up in like Ohio, Mississippi, all that up there, came down. Now that steamboat, the Bertha Lee, had a kind of interesting history because the owners wanted to put her down on around Kissimmee and Lake Okeechobee and stuff. And so basically she sailed from Fort Myers to Kissimmee. It normally would have taken 3 to 5 days, but it took them 53 days because the water depth was so shallow. And sometimes they would have to turn the steamboat around to use the stern wheel to kick up dirt to be able to basically dredge its own channel, or the crew would have to jump out, shovel it to dig, 3.5, 4 feet deep to allow the steamboat to come through. So it took 53 days. They ran low on food and wood. They got to the point they were bartering with the Seminole Indians in the area for those things to be able to get through. So they eventually got her through on the Kissimmee River that way, and they realized, you know what, not gonna work out. So they moved to the St. Johns River to a guy by the name of Captain Benjamin Franklin Hall Jr., who, I think I've got a picture on the next slide of him. And he operated her for a little bit, but then he moved her over to the Suwannee River. So 1885, 1886, she was working on the Suwannee River, advertisements talking about her, but she just wasn't very profitable either. So they moved the Bertha Lee to the Apalachicola River, where she ran for a few years until she ran aground. Captain Hall basically lost his entire savings on her and had to work as a hotel clerk for a few years before he could regain some fortune. He bought other steamboats later on in Central Florida. This is a picture of Captain Hall, Irish descent. He was a Quaker, lived around Lynn, Massachusetts before he moved to Pittsburgh, and then West Virginia. And Civil War, he served on a gunboat, was wounded in action, and then he retired to Ohio. He eventually moved down to Florida. He wanted to visit Florida. He ended up living here until he died. Another big steamboat operator on the Suwannee River was Captain Robert Ivy. I've already talked about him as a ferry operator and the founder of Branford, pretty much. He was born in Georgia. As a youth, he served in the Confederate Army as a water boy before they realized he was only like 12 or 14, and they kicked him out. But he served briefly in the Civil War. After the war, he and his brothers, Jess and FC, moved to what's now Branford, began buying up land, and established that ferry we've already talked about. And he built the Belle of Suwannee, the most famous steamboat probably on the river, in 1889. He also built a steamboat named C.D. Owens, which was named after one of his railroad buddies. Also, two others named Suwannee. He liked the word Suwannee. So at least three of his steamboats had the word Suwannee in it. He had also several others that ran the river. Had a hotel on the Suwannee River, at Branford, that his steamboats could use. These are some of his steamboats. This is the Suwannee with one end. And the first one that we know of shows up in July of 1889, 70 feet long, 16 and a half feet wide, drawn to 4 feet. Don't know if it was a new boat built in Branford or kind of using the engines from an earlier boat, which was called the Susie B, which was built in 1880, and just kind of built a new boat around it. We don't know for sure. Either way, that one was sold further south in 1889, and it was used down in South Central Florida, and was used for many years. One of the actual men who often chartered it was a guy you might have heard of by the name of Thomas Edison. And so he would travel on her. He was very fond of the steamboat. Unfortunately, during the Great Hurricane down south in 1926, she was sunk on Lake Okeechobee. 3 years later, Henry Ford, who was a friend of Thomas Edison, salvaged part of the boat, basically the engines and some of the timber, and then built a new Suwannee, which you can see on the bottom right. And he put it up at Greenfield Village, eventually the Henry Ford Museum there in Dearborn, Michigan. It lasted for a very long time until 2011. They finally scrapped her. So that's a picture before she scrapped. So it doesn't quite look the same, but it is using parts of the older Suwannee. But this one is the most famous steamboat of Captain Ivy's, the Belle of Suwannee, named after his daughter, Bertha, who was the belle in his eyes. Entered service December of 1889, built in Branford, close to where the railroad depot is today. 180 tons, 111 feet long, 24 feet wide. And let's see. She was famous for having the bridal suite, like the honeymoon bridal suite. And also famous for the catfish dinners that she would serve. When she was not transporting honeymooners or passengers, she would transport a lot of freight. And you can see kind of here, this is actually down at Branford. And you can see passengers on the top deck, the upper deck, lower deck, has a lot of wood for the engines and also freight. But that's what a lot of them did. She would also carry blocks of ice upriver to Louisville, where Dr. Perry McIntosh had an ice house. So she would bring that ice up there to allow him to store stuff. Let's see, normally a crew of 15. Her most famous pilot was probably Dan McQueen. We'll talk about him on the next slide very briefly. Bella Suwannee was damaged in 1896 during that hurricane that we had that wrecked Cedar Key and Branford and a lot of other places in this area. Probably the worst one we had for destruction-wise until the ones we had a couple years ago. But wiped out a lot of the timber industry. Several steamboats were destroyed or damaged. Bella Suwannee, they thought she was lost also until Dan McQueen sailed her back in to port. She was missing her funnels and pilot house, and she was damaged. Basically, all this stuff here. Pilot house, funnels, all that stuff was gone, but the majority of the boat was still there. So she was repaired, but kind of the fortunes had changed. Not everybody was wanting to ride on steamboats anymore, and so she was sold to another firm and operated until 1900, when she was basically towing timber and stuff to Cedar Key. She sank near the mouth of the Suwannee River. She was badly damaged in the hurricane of 1896, blown ashore. They were able to repair her. She was refloated and started sailing around, and I've got notes on her review of her boilers and all, and annual steamboat inspections. But eventually she was sold to Savannah in 1903, but she was sometimes operated on the Suwannee River anyway. Last time she shows up on the Suwannee River is in 1911. So, don't know what happened to her after that. Obviously no longer exists. Another one of the steamboats on the Suwannee was Louisa. This was built by Captain E.L. Magruder, who was a competitor of Captain Ivy. And this boat was pretty big, 200 tons, 101 feet long, 25 feet wide, and 5 feet of draught. She was built in Dublin, Georgia in 1890. And so he ran her on several places, but she was on the Suwannee River for a little while. But then he sold her to South Carolina, and she sank on the Santee River in 1904. Now this is a picture of Louisa down near Louisville. Actually, the community was called Peak, which was actually on the river. The railroad depot was right there at the edge of the river. You can see this ramp. Pretty much the railroad could back right up to the steamboat and unload and load. So very, very easy to do. And you'll see another picture here, maybe the next picture or two, next slide. Basically another steamboat at the same location there at Peak, which is, we call it Louisville today, but it was actually a separate community, separate from Louisville at that time. So let's see, yeah, right here, this one, C.D. Owens. This was another one Captain Ivy built. It was his largest steamboat, 231 tons, 135 feet long, 33 feet wide. Named after one of the Savannah, Florida and Western Railroad operators, bigwig. So he operated her for a little while, and then he sold her to E.L. Magruder and his company. She went over the Chattahoochee, Apalachicola River run, which was more profitable by this point. And she was destroyed by fire in 1899 in Columbus, Georgia. And not only did she burn herself up, but a couple other steamboats with her. So this picture was basically taken, you can see the same building in the background, this one here. So, same location, different steamboat.
Eric?
Yes, sir.
What was the population of the county during that period of time?
Probably 10 to 15,000.
Okay, thank you.
Around 1900, yeah, 1890s. And half of those were in Live Oak almost, so. All right, hurricane of 1896, I've already mentioned it a couple times, but basically it hit Cedar Key and the lower, especially the lower Suwannee River area, October 30th, 1896, affected the entire economy of the area. We've got steamboats destroyed, steamboats damaged, terrible, terrible death and destruction. This is a picture of Cedar Key. And you might not know this, but Cedar Key, the town of Cedar Key today is not on the same island that it was on before this hurricane. Two different keys. After this hurricane smashed pretty much everything, they moved what was left to a different island, a different key. One was like Depot Key, and that's Noe, I think was where it was. So basically they moved it. So all that's left of the original Cedar Key are a couple of, you can see parts of like this kind of stuff, and some of the tombstones from graves that end in 1896. Because after that, they were moved a little bit closer inshore. So if you go to Cedar Key, you will find out that's not the original location. But it destroyed lots of damage. Even in Branford, pretty much every building was destroyed except for, I think, one church. And they had to take turn, all the different churches down there had to take turns using the one building, because that's about all that was left. And supposedly, I think it was being propped up by other trees, things like that. It's crazy, crazy. Yeah, it was on at Sena Odie Key, and it moved to Waikiki or Depot Key, which is where it is today. That was Cedar Key. It totally had to move. That was how devastating it was. But it knocked trees down, kind of like what we had a year ago. It was like that. So after the hurricane, a lot of folks lost a lot of money on their steamboats because there just wasn't the need for them as much. And there was not as much timber being transported because a lot of it had been knocked down, destroyed. And so folks like Captain Ivy sold a lot of his steamboats. Captain Magruder sold his steamboats, those kinds of things. And we've already talked about Belle Suwannee sinking. Let's see. But they did bring in a few other smaller steamboats after that. So sometime around 1898, Captain Ivy brought in a steamboat called the C.U. Shepherd, built in Jacksonville in 1892, and she was used to haul phosphate on the Withlacoochee, on the central Florida Withlacoochee River anyway, and then it was sold to Ivy. She was only 12 tons. So we're going from 200 tons, 100 tons down to 12 tons. 52 feet long, 18 feet wide. So a much smaller boat. That's all he could afford to do, and that was all that was affordable for him on the Suwannee River anyway. So she was used for a few years up and down the river, Cedar Key and Hudson, which is now Dowling Park. She was sold in 1902. By 1904, she was no longer in service. Captain Magruder still operated a few more. He brought the steamboat Thetis on the river in 1898. She was 61 tons, so again, a lot smaller than the other ones. One deck, carried no passengers as far as we know. She steamed up and down the river for a few years. There was a note in 1903, the annual inspection, noted that while steaming on the Suwannee River, Thetis's African-American chief engineer, a guy by the name of Peter Walker, fell overboard and drowned due to heart trouble. A lot of folks couldn't swim then anyway, but it wouldn't have helped him, even if he hadn't had the heart trouble. So the Thetis was one of the last steamboats on the Suwannee River. She was steaming up and down until the winter of 1913, and I think some of her remains are still in the river today. But Dan McQueen was one of the operators or captains of her. Three Saints was one of the last steamboats to arrive. She was 126 tons, 140 feet long, built in 1898 in Apalachicola, and ran only for about 6 months on the Suwannee River in 1901. Then she went over to Apalachicola and Chattahoochee. That's a picture of her, I believe, at Branford. So you can see the folks getting off. City of Hawkinsville would end up being the last steamboat operating on the Suwannee River. She was brought in 1898. One of the largest vessels. She was 319 tons, so she basically was the biggest steamboat on the Suwannee River and also the last one. 141 feet long, 31 feet wide, and about 6 foot drafts, so a little bit deeper than the other ones. She was on, on the Altamaha River and stuff first, but then came to Florida, and she steamed up and down the river, especially around Cedar Key. She was operating a lot of times towing cedar down to the pencil companies down at Cedar Key in that area. But in 1914, she stopped running. She was stripped partially and then allowed to sink. And this actually shows a good view of a lot of these steamboats. This is all open for cargo and for wood, and then you've got some passenger spots on top. But she was stripped and sunk, and her remains are there today around Old Town. These are some pictures, underwater pictures of her today. But kind of like with ferries, you've got railroads coming in, you've got vehicles being created and spreading widespread. So it became less and less profitable to operate these steamboats. And so one by one, they were sold off, they were lost. Maybe they were sold off down to Central and South Florida where it was not as, well, it was more profitable anyway at the time. Or they were just allowed to sink, and that's what happened in the city of Hawkinsville. So no steamboats on the Suwannee River today. And it'd be kind of hard to because the bridges are not high enough. I've talked with folks over the years about it'd be nice to have the steamboat excursions, but our bridges are really too low. Because the bridges we had, the first generation of vehicle bridges and railroad bridges actually turned. So even though you had steamboats, you could turn the center, and so they could go up and down river. We don't have those anymore. All right, last section. Last section is aircraft and airfields. And I've expanded this one since last time I talked about it. Done some more research on it. Not sure how long aircraft have been flying in and over Suwannee County. Regardless, I'm sure the first one to fly over probably scared some folks and probably brought a lot of oohs and ahs. We don't know because our newspaper records that far back are gone. They've been destroyed when the Suwannee Democrat burned down. So we don't know exactly when the first plane flew over Suwannee County or landed in Suwannee County. The first one I have record of was November of 1918. And it is in an article copied from an earlier Suwannee Democrat. But basically this is what it said in the little editor's note. Quote, Live Oak citizens were all out in the streets Tuesday afternoon, gazing at the skies, watching the maneuvers of an airboat, or what they call an airbird, circling over town looking for a convenient place to land. When it was known that the plane would land on the Charles Basin place near town, scores of autos filled with citizens went out to get a view of the airbird, and so great and eager were the spectators to investigate that a rope had to be thrown around the plane to keep them away. On investigation, it was learned that 2 occupants had come to Live Oak to attend the wedding of Mr. Cobb and Miss Lula Hardy, sister of Mrs. F.S. Paramore and Colonel Carrie A. Hardy, which occurred yesterday morning. Wednesday afternoon, the plane rose and circled over town and distributed war literature. We were still in World War I at that point. Landing in a field southeast of the city. It is stated that the men were partially investigating suitable places as a landing station between Americus, Georgia and Arcadia, Florida, and were favorably impressed with Live Oak as one of the stations, provided the city will take necessary steps for the accommodations. The flight from Americus was made without a stop, 2 hours and 20 minutes, nearly 1.5 miles per minute. 90 miles per hour, basically. That was a big deal back then. So for the next month, there were a few more landings. They were kind of looking at different places. Late November, the quote was, 3 big airplanes hove into sight last Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock and hovered over the city and finally landed in the basin field near town. This was another expedition sent out for the purpose of selecting sites, taking photographs, and making maps for aviation purposes. According to Lieutenant Stackpole in charge of the party, the towns selected by the government as landing stations will have hangars and all other necessary equipment for regular landings with the ultimate purpose of having air mail service. So, yeah, they were looking at Live Oak. Let's see, a couple of weeks later, more quotes, landed at Basin Field. The weather was unfavorable the next day, so they basically did some stunts over the city and the old fairgrounds before they left. They'd flown from Arcadia, and they were hoping to come back before Christmas or around Christmas to stop in Live Oak. In 1919, April of 1919, World War I is over, but they're still looking at different sites. In 1919, we have the first known airplane crash in Suwannee County, and it quotes 2 Curtiss biplanes en route from Carlstrom Field to Sutherfield at Americus, Georgia, came to grief here last Friday afternoon in attempting a landing. The first machine was driven by Lieutenant B.S. or D.S. Thompson, who had actually come here a couple months before, which was flying alone, located the former landing west of town, but the landing place had been plowed up and he came down among the stumps, thereby wrecking his machine. He signaled Lieutenant J.C. Hall, who was accompanied by Sergeant J.E. Dorr, not to land. Lieutenant Hall then flew back to J.O. Ross's field east of town, his watermelon patch to be exact. The sand was so deep the machine was upset after striking the earth. No one was hurt, and Lieutenant Hall repaired his machine and left for Sutherfield Sunday. The other machine was wrecked beyond repair and shipped in. The damage to both machines was about $6,000. That's about $111,000 today. The aviators were in no wise to blame for the accidents. They had orders to stop here for gas. So basically, they tried to land. The owners had plowed it up because it was a field, and so the planes wrecked, crashed. Funny. it's hard to find information on the early airfields and stuff, but I did find in 1930, Mr. S.C. Sansbury, and that was actually the 1918 one there. Mr. S.C. Sansbury, who was a auto supply houseman here in Suwannee County, he purchased a plane like this, a Heath monoplane, for personal use. And a quote in the article was, "The landing field generally used here has received some improvements and additional leveling work will be done. A shed will be built at an edge of the field where the plane will be housed." No description as to where it was. Don't know if it's the same one from 10, 15 years before. Don't know. Don't know. In 1931, between 25 and 40 aircraft visited Live Oak. They landed at the field after an air meeting in Miami. Basically, they were met by people that drove cars, drove them around town, entertained them. They brought hot coffee and sandwiches. Said the Live Oak flying field was north of the city. Still don't know where it was though. They even had a wind indicator there, but don't know exactly where it was. No description. And some of these Democrats we don't have anymore. Let's see, 1933, Live Oak City Council decided to include an airport in a list of projects. So they got some money to provide a 60-acre strip to be leased from 10 years from J.B. Clark and Mrs. Wiley Bird. So they did that. Don't know for sure. Have a good idea. It's probably about where the current airport is. They erected a fence and improving the field. 1934, they looked at the lease. Blah, blah, blah. Going through my notes. Yeah, so basically federal money, local money for leasing, building, those kinds of things. Co-sponsoring a landing field for the Navy during World War II, which may be the same spot that the current airport is. There was also discussion in 1945 about providing better access to Madison Highway. They were going to clear some more trees. They were going to mow and remove tall weeds and grass that were on the field. That'd be a good thing to do. And they had it now at a length of 2,200 feet and 150 feet wide. So they kept doing that. In the meantime, as that is going on as a joint city-county project, more or less, Randolph Mai, who was from Duval County, moved to Suwannee County in 1948. He basically built a home. He was the guy who had established the Suwannee Rural Theater, which was a theater group, and oversaw it for many years. He also became head of our Suwannee County Civil Defense. In 1952, he was involved in lots of organizations over the years. He was also a pilot. So in 1948, he approached the county commission about grading an airstrip on his property for emergency uses. And the board agreed, we'll let 8 hours of grading work be done on that airstrip because it's going to be used for emergency purposes for folks and for local aviation. So basically, it's not just for me, it's for other folks too. He also established a Civil Air Patrol unit called the Suwannee Squadron. By 1951, he's in charge of it. And there's basically discussion of the Civil Air Patrol. What they do, what they've been doing for 80 plus years now, is basically they're civilians who operate aircraft, search and rescue, those kinds of things. Done that for many years. My son was a part of that for a couple of years out of the Gainesville unit, which was the closest one at the time. And so a lot of times probably was carried out on his airfield, which this became the location of this field, because basically what happened was Captain Mai sold the property to the guy on the right named Dr. J.D. Workman, and it became the first airfield in the nation operated by the Civil Air Patrol. Otherwise, it was just Civil Air Patrol people using private fields or city or county ones. But this one was established as the first one to be operated exclusively by an organized captain Civil Air Patrol unit. So 1951, it was open, a lot of fanfare. The representatives from the national headquarters in DC came down. Let's see, the governor was here, state aviation director was here, a lot of folks. Betty Skelton was here, which was a women's champion aerobatic aviatrix. So she was a pilot and pioneer. Also Zach Mosley, who was the creator of what was called the Smiling Jack comic strip, longest running aviation comic strip in American history. Lots of folks were there.
Is that airfield out east, was it east of town?
Yeah, 136. Basically where the where 136 crosses the interstate, goes over the interstate.
I thought it was on nine.
Well, this one was on the north side of the interstate, north side of where 136 crosses. You know, it curves and then goes to the east again. It was right back there. I think the subdivision is now there.
Randy May was flying when I came here.
Oh, okay.
Every day.
That doesn't surprise me.
Every morning he flew.
Well, this, I mean, he might have had his own place somewhere else, but this is the Workman Field.
Okay.
That was,
He usually took off out there on 90, just on the other side of Gum Slough.
okay,
There you go.
okay.
But it's May, Randy May.
May, thank you, May, okay, thank you. Randy May, appreciate it, thank you. I didn't know. I just read the names, I don't hear them ever, but yeah, Randy May, thank you for correcting that. But yeah, this is the Workman Field. You can see it's got the 2 runways and hangar space and that kind of stuff. But you know, big deal. Lions Club, JC's, Kiwanis Club, Rotary, the Senior and Junior Women's Clubs, the Boy Scouts, the Sea Scouts, the State Troopers, Sheriff's Office, Chamber of Commerce, all those kind of folks were there. One thing I did notice in reading through documents were a lot of stamp collectors wanted stamps sent from this airfield and stuff, so it's kind of interesting. So Suwannee Squadron created a cap stamp just for that ceremony, and people collected it from all over the country. Kind of interesting. 3,000 people attended. Big deal. They had the Miss Cap De-Icer pageant contest for any girl, single or married, between 15 and 25. Doesn't say who won. That I found in the records. So this Cap Squadron and this Workman Field continued to operate for several years. Dr. Workman sold his airplane that he had bought, and somebody crashed shortly thereafter with the plane, seriously injured. This property the Workman Field was eventually sold to Arlie K. Townsend. I'm sure you knew him.
Yeah.
Remember him. Arlie K. Townsend, who then transferred to the other folks. It was still listed in 1960s as an airport, but it doesn't look like it was really being used as much. I've got a 1963 aerial photo, and it shows it planted in trees. So the field only lasted about 10 years, unfortunately. Very sad. And the Cap Squadron operated for a few years. Don't know when they disbanded, but Nikki Sacrios was in it at one point. Norm Protzman was a part of it. So a lot of well-known folks actually had a dedicated nurses flight. So there were enough folks involved in it. And it was expanding into other places. Probably by the late 50s it closed up.
They would report on any unknown planes.
Mm-hmm.
Billy got famous because he saw a flight of geese, and he reported Canadian geese. And reported it was an enemy plane that was.
Oh no. Cold War era was so fun.
Yeah, it was a Cold War era.
Crazy. That's crazy. Well, you know, those geese could be dangerous, you never knew. But anyway, they kind of simply faded into history. I don't know when they shut down. Another group was set up in 2006 called the Suwannee Valley Composite Squadron. Mark and Cindy Schweitzer were deputy commanders. Grant Meadows Jr. was commander. In 2007, we had a lot of fires around Suwannee County. They assisted with that. They got a unit citation because of that. That fire burned 580,000 acres in 7 weeks. It was bad.
Where was it?
It was northwest of here, Columbia County, South Georgia. But I mean, it was smoky here. I've got pictures in the office. I mean, it's like LA pollution smog look. It was bad.
Did it originate in Okefenokee?
Yeah, it was all up in South Georgia, but it had come into Lafayette, up into Columbia County a little bit. It was bad.
Drove a lot of bears out too.
Yes, a lot of everything. It was
Where
terrible.
was that?
No, 2007.
Okay, that's what, when we were down there. We went down there, and it happened right after or right before?
It was bad. I mean, it was seeping into your houses.
Maybe during when we were there.
It was bad.
Yeah. I remember.
But they operated for several years, that squadron. They became the Suwannee Valley Cadet Squadron by 2011. And it looks like they merged with Lake City's group. and I can't find where Suwannee Valley Cadet Squadron exists. Today, there's one called the Suwannee River Composite Squadron, which was chartered a couple years ago in October of 2022 and operates out of Branford. So, you know, our Civil Air Patrol history, workman field history, something I didn't know about until a few years ago when I was just having to come across it. It's like, what is this? And why is it? And then I realized it was a big deal at the time. So, lots of discussions, but in 1956, Ed Butler, Dan Chandler, and B.W. Huddleston III petitioned the board of county commissioners on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce, hey, you need to grade and clear a runway, the one off Dearborn Road, on the land of Mr. Chandler for the public airstrip. So the board said, we'll do that. A few years later, Dan Chandler is chairman of the Suwannee County Airport Committee, and they basically approved a contract to build the Suwannee County Airport. Lots of discussions of it, get a lot of federal funding, at least $30,000 is what it cost back then. Scheduled to be about a 3,200 foot long runway, lots of different stuff. It's finally starts construction in 1964. I've got pages of notes, so I'm just kind of skimming through them. Lots of money. Montgomery Brothers is the one that is selected to build it. It's dedicated in 1965. In 1967, they talked about a management plan for the airport. In 1969, they approved the construction of a lounge, an office pilot lounge to be made of brick. And that was the dedication day for it. And that's a more recent picture of it. It's been expanded obviously since then. Get grants, they build more hangars, those kinds of things. But this is not the only airport or airfield in Suwannee County today. You've got a bunch of them. List I found a few months ago has 18. Like Buckner Airport, Buddy's Ag Service Airport, Cooksey Brothers Airport, Florida Sheriff's Boys Ranch Airport, Flying Sea Farm Airport, Keokuk Estates, Lazy Boy, Little River, Moss Meadows, O'Brien Airport, Pittman Oaks, Red Barn Acres, Suwannee Bell, Suwannee Farms, The Trails, Whitefield, Wings and Sunsets. This picture is the Flying Little River Airport, which is 3 miles southeast of McAlpin. It was opened in 1977. So this is a picture of it with a lot of the locals come and have a little fly off, those kinds of things. So it's interesting. Lots of little airfields. Now most of them are private or used by like the Boys Ranch for certain events, those kinds of things, or farm related, but you know, lots of little air parks. Canyon Creek is over in Lake City. We know some folks that live there, so it's pretty fun to go out there. They've got their fly offs and they'll just like, you know, we're gonna go to Gainesville for breakfast, so we're gonna fly. And they take off and we haven't done it, but they'll take off and fly to Gainesville for breakfast and come back, and it's just kind of interesting, very interesting. So that is transportation other than railroads in Suwannee County. Next month is our last presentation of the series. Ernie, you're coming in late, but I'll restart it.
Well, I found out where to get you, YouTube.
Yeah, okay, that'll help too. So next month will be more of an interactive question answer session. So it may be shorter, maybe longer, depending on how long y'all talk. But we'll wrap it up, and then I'll probably start back, Lord willing, in January, if there's enough interest, and go from there.